Good morning, folks. Welcome to everyone who is joining the call through the recordings. We had a long and rich discussion about outreach that was not at all technical, and now we're going to move on to the notion of parts of objects, and in particular the discussion over the last couple of weeks about how to model the different parts of parts, and when should things be features or should they be objects themselves. So the issue where the majority of the discussion has taken place, I'll put into the chat, but it's issue 84 in the GitHub repository that Vlad opened back in 2017. And I would say the easiest introduction is the little diagram that I put in yesterday. So the current model is the simple but loose interpretation side, which is that any part is just an object, a man-made E22 man-made object, to Antoine's point in Slack about not just putting in numbers and confusing everyone who hasn't memorized which entity number is which class. So that the interesting thing here is the center. Thank you to Thanasis for the vocabulary link. Is certainly an object, right? That was created in a very separate production event and was then put into the cover of the manuscript. And the same with the clasps and the corner pieces, whatever those are called in binding terminology, and so on. So that's definitely an object in its own right. The codex is definitely an object in its own right, so the book itself. But then the cover could be simply part of a larger piece that sort of has both the back cover, the front cover, and the spine. Or if you think about a page in a manuscript, certainly you have quires that are then stitched and cut and folded, and sometimes not even cut. So you might have a bifolium that is folio 1 recto and verso and folio 8 recto and verso. That simply goes all the way through. Then there is a relatively arbitrary section of that single bit of parchment that is folio 1 recto, the front of the first page, which means that the cover as the example, the cover, if it wrapped around, would be a feature, which is in Thanasis's version, which then has a part of it, which is a place that holds, and I think we agree that can hold permanently, the center. So this is a stricter interpretation of what it means to be an object than what we have at the moment. It has some benefits in that you are not saying that there is an object that is somehow indistinguishably part of some other object, or not able to be objectively defined as to exactly where it is. But it's more complicated. So the partitioning, the simple version, simply says, the center is part of the cover and the cover is part of the book, which everyone understands intuitively, I hope. The stricter version is there is a cover object which is part of the book, but the cover is both covers and the spine. And part of a feature of that object is the front part of the front cover. And then because that's just a somewhat abstract space, there is a place which is part of that, which is the section of that cover feature, which then has something permanently embedded in it. So when you, it's slightly longer to say, but yes, you could imagine that someone takes that center out and replaces it with something that has the same shape, or that's the front of the cover does exist underneath that center, and hence if you took the center out, there would still be the front of the cover, it would just not have the center on it. So if you then superglued something onto the front cover, you haven't changed the original front cover, you've simply attached something to it, albeit permanently. So does that then, would that then change the front cover? And this is what the complicated model allows us to be more specific about, but with the added complexity. So to try, given that the CRM SIG meeting is this week in Crete, we don't have George and Thanasis and Marilena, but to try to then sort of be impartial, I think the simple case is probably as good as our data allows us to be, and gives us the opportunity to then have a more consistent model when we have objects that are spread across institutions. So if you imagine the very frequent case where a triptych is split up and different institutions have different panels, the panels would be E22 objects because they're catalogued separately. You know, they're completely separate from the other parts of the original triptych. But then the triptych itself is still an object, even if it's one that is physically dispersed. So you would still have the object has part, panel object. One of the cases that I sent from our museum, not only was it part of a larger thing, it was also cut in half, and there is the other half of that panel in Venice. So then is that then we would still want to call it a man-made object, even though it's part of the larger panel that could be reconstructed down the line. So if you had a object that represented the full panel, it would have two parts, the one that's currently in Venice and the one that's currently in Los Angeles, which to me sounds a lot like what we're doing with the covers, that there is a part that happens to currently be on the cover, it's the center, or the clasp, or the whatever, but that it wasn't always there. And hence my preference, given the amount of data that we have, which is from the responses so far, somewhere about 5% of objects in our various systems have partitioning to some degree. So it's not even the common case, it's only 1 in 20. And the consistency and simplicity, to me, outweighs the looser interpretation and the lack of semantic precision of just using objects all the way down. But, of course, is what do people think? Dave notes it's more like 15% for some institutions, and if we treat coins as always having two parts, front and obverse and reverse, then it's 100% for people like Ethan. So, any thoughts on this, or questions if it's not not clear?
Well, I have one question. This is Pat Hayes. And this partly stems from my being a beginner with your model. But what difference does it make? Is my initial sort of immediate question when a difficult layer shows up. If you don't say what can't you infer, or what can you infer that you don't want to infer from the simpler of these two?
Yeah. So the simpler way means that you can't say, or it's more complicated, or less obvious, how you would say that there is a single bifolium page. So in a as a recovering librarian, I always think about books, but so apologies to people who don't think books is the first example. But if you have a single piece of parchment that wraps around and then has others sewn into it, then the sort of traditional way would be to say that there is an object which is folio 1, recto and verso, front and back of the first page, the front and the front and back of the 8th page or 16th page. Then we could split it up into further objects, being the front of the first page, the back of the first page, and so on. And then you could further partition those pages into objects, such as the illustration on the front of the first page. But then semantically, you can't, without cutting the object out, or cutting the illustration out, which of course does happen a lot. There's no objective way to really define what the object is, which is the illustration. It's really just a feature of that front page. It's the area of the page that contains the illumination.
And as a mere feature, it can't have properties of its own. Is that right?
It can have almost all of the same properties as objects. The properties that it can't have are a location of its own, because it's a feature of something that has a location.
Yeah.
So you would introduce a paradox by saying that the object that has the feature was in a different location to the feature, because otherwise it couldn't be a feature of the object. And a couple of others that are less obvious as to why. So the real difference is the documentation process. That if there is a simple rule of always use a man-made object for all parts of all things, all objects, that's a one-sentence rule. And if the rule is, or the explanation is, if there is something which is inseparable from the object and has no objectively defined boundary conditions, then it's a feature that contain, and if there is if there are objects that are related to that feature, then they are related via a place which is relative to the location of the feature on the object. I think that's the shortest way to describe it, but is probably completely opaque to most people on this call, let alone people who we want to actually use the model.
So to me, this sounds like we're at we could be reasonably slapdash about what an object is, which would make it more convenient for both people consuming the data and people creating the data, but leads us to statements that someone trying to infer knowledge out of this would find wrong, like this illustration is an object. or we could be precise and say there are some in the world which are objects, and there are some other man-made things which are just features of those objects. But it raises the level of effort for both people creating the data because they have to decide, and people consuming the data because they have to check for both objects and for.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So then the sort of the hierarchy of constituencies, having it be easy to consume and produce seems to far outweigh ease of people trying to do inference on data that's messy at the best of times.
Can I just check, if we're thinking about the linked art model as sort of the published, exposed API model, is there anything that would logically stop, someone who is using the full CRM model from flattening it deterministically to the simplified model consistently?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Kevin. It could be, well, just looking at the diagram, if there was some way to say all covers in the richer model should be features with places, then it seems like it would be possible to sort of translate from one to the other. I don't think they could exist simultaneously in the same system without duplicating identities. So you can't have something that is both a man-made object and a feature at the same time because they're disjoint classes.
Right. So that, because to me, if our primary aim is interoperability, that's a very good motivation to simplify. But what we don't want to do is preclude people using the full CRM model internally. Yeah. I don't know many examples of anyone doing that, but that's not something we want to accidentally prevent. So I think always being able to test how that would work is quite an important factor, but is also therefore a justification to simplify if it holds true.
Yep.
That's an interesting question as to whether people would want to simultaneously hold both structures in the same system. And again, maybe that comes down to your viewpoint as to whether the linked art will be produced essentially as a projection that's an API based on the underlying system or not.
Yep.
I will say that the other thing I've run into is that I think this gets to the point that Emmanuel was making earlier. We are dealing with people who do think very deeply about the nature of the objects in their collection. And I admit that I've had some very difficult conversations trying to explain to curators why we are treating the illustration as an object, or why we are treating the artworky part of the painting different as a thing, because then they start thinking about, are you planning for canvas separation or those sorts of things? So I think one of the areas that I've run into is that the nuances of feature and object, while not clear, are the sorts of things that our domain experts actually do spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think it makes the data transformer's job easier, but I feel like a lot of our constituents, the art historian type, really do care about this nuance. And so I think it's this, it doesn't do us any good to simplify to the point where the statements we are making no longer reflect the beliefs of the people who are making those statements.
Well, actually, I'd like to react to what you've just said, Dave. So this is Antoine, and maybe reflecting a bit the Europeana perspective on this. We probably reckon indeed that experts have deep thoughts about it, but across institutions, it's probably likely that they think differently about it. And while some experts will maybe object to certain things being an object, some others will really want to have this. And the best way to accommodate this diversity is to make as little as possible commitment in terms of hard typing, I mean typing by classes, and to let experts represent their judgment by softer typing. I mean DC type kind of statements. And actually, I believe that, I mean, the example that that Rob has presented is quite nice, because I believe that in many cases, and I'm thinking of books cover that may have some more prominent parts or on the features, like a precious stone or something like that. Actually, the cataloging may omit to describe the cover at all, and the stone would be directly attached to the book, because that's maybe a case in some institutions that they don't have the resource to create super complex data, and they go straight to the main points. And handling that diversity is going to be hard if we encourage everyone to go for the complex model.
Yeah, I think it is. The example that I would use as the counterexample is, if I have a painting in which the front was done by one artist and then another artist painted on the back of that canvas, this model would say we have an object, which is the artwork, and it has a part, which is the object, which is the painting on the front of the canvas, and a separate object, which is the painting on the back of the canvas, all of which are objects. And that sort of statement is a sort of thing where I feel like I would have a really hard time explaining why that is a thing, and why it's not just a description of a part of that artwork.
Yeah, so to that example, because this is the lovely one from Jeannie at the Met, where not only is it recto and verso of the same sheet, but the artworks are at 90 degrees to each other, right? One is portrait, the face of the person, and the other is landscape, the chalets. So the dimensions of the two different objects are recorded differently because they have different height and width. So to me, this is also a case where having different objects will reflect what the data actually has in the system, as opposed to necessarily how it might best be described if we were starting from zero. So if they're different records, essentially, in the underlying data management system, then having them as separate objects that are part of the parent object will help to ensure that there is consistency, and that we don't need to have very complicated algorithms to try to distinguish which partitioning is a feature because it's the front of the sheet, and which partitionings are parts because it's the center, which is part of the book. So yeah, again, it's the trade-off between getting, or rather, every complicated decision we make reduces our adoption, or makes the adoption harder. So for me, having the simpler model and expressing how you can either reduce a more complicated model to it, or if you feel like it's important to get to to use a more complicated model, how to go from the simple up to the complex fits in with the constituencies that we're trying to improve the lives of.
Can I ask?
Sorry.
Emmanuel.
Sorry. Can I ask which model would accommodate best the type of objects that we have many of here at the center, which are sketchbooks? So the question in front of me is really thinking about the sequence of pages. Would the place class help with that? Obviously, for a sketchbook, having the correct order of pages is important, especially as we think about forgeries or books being cut out of and things like this. So yeah, how would the page sequence fit in either models?
Yeah, I think it would be the same for both models. There would be a physical object, which is the page, and then the pages would have either objects, which is the front, and an object which is the back, and which would then be typed with P2 has typed to a vocabulary entry to say this is recto and this is verso, or reverse and obverse for coins. And then the artwork is on that page, on the front side of the page.
I think the question was, if I have a book of pages, how do I say which part is page 1 and which part is page 2?
Yeah, so the feature-based one doesn't give you any more or less functionality when it comes to sequencing and pages. It's just there are more objects. The features are a section of an object, or they're a part of, or they're an object which is part of the larger object, and then the sequencing is would work in probably exactly the same way for either the features or for the objects. So I don't think
there a way to
matters, basically.
Is there a way to reify, because we can reify the feature object relationship with things like location or place? Is there a reification mechanism to talk about how something is partitioned?
There's part addition and part removal, but that is that would imply that there was some activity that explicitly added that particular page, and that the pages were added in some particular temporal sequence as opposed to ending up in a physical sequence.
Right. And we don't want to do attribute assignment to say this thing was defined to have this part with this metadata.
Yeah, right.
Because that would be nasty.
That would be even worse than than the existing ones. Well, let's do a straw poll, given that's the hour. Could you put into the chat Rob or object or feature, if you prefer the object model or for the feature-based model, and we'll see if there's a reasonable consensus in one direction or the other. If there's one or two people who prefer objects and everyone else prefers features, then that's clear. If there's one or two people who prefer features and everyone else prefers objects, that's clear. But yeah, we can. This is one of those lovely theoretical things that we can talk about for ever, and we need at some point to make a decision.
But I feel like the more I think about this, I feel like explaining how parts relate to each other in terms of where they are is really important. Mm-hmm. Especially when we think of contemporary art, for example, and installations, right? So a sequence, not quite of pages, but of placement in a room, for example. And I guess I'm a little bit frustrated that none of these two models are answering this question.
Yeah. Well, we can, why don't we then, everyone, look to see what sort of placement related topics issues we have in our data. And then Emmanuel, if you want to come up with a couple of exemplary ones, we could talk through them next time.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I actually sent one on by Damien Hurst. That's really interesting.
And yeah, both the Met and ourselves, we have sort of a room which is set up. I'm sure lots of museums have such installations with different walls and lots of different objects and so on that could be represented. There's, assuming that Thanasis is in favor of features. 1, 2.
I actually voted for object, but
yeah. Yes, and indeed, I agree with both Kevin and Dave that as long as we can represent our use cases reasonably faithfully and there's a way to go up and down, then I think we're in good shape regardless. And maybe it is just a documentation point that we can try to work through. But it is past the top of the hour, so thank you all very much, and we'll continue the discussions in a couple of weeks' time. So yes, if you can send, continue to send examples to the mailing list, and we will keep working on them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, Emmanuel?
Yeah, I see your, yeah. Oh.
They're both, yeah, they're both subclasses of E18 physical thing, but then physical feature diverges to, so there's physical thing, physical feature, man-made feature is one branch, then physical thing, man-made thing, man-made object, and then a third path that is again something different, but I forget exactly what it is. But yeah, unfortunately, they're not. Yeah.
How can they not be?
Yeah. So we could go back and say that things that are feature-like are just E18s, but then they don't get the man-made objectness.
Right.
Man-madeness, sorry, so they don't get production. And we absolutely need to say that it was produced. So otherwise, yeah, this would be not a non-issue, but there would be a much easier proposal.
Thank you for, okay, I get it now. Yep, all right. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Yep, thanks.
Bye-bye.